When a billionaire returned home earlier than expected, he walked into a scene that nearly stopped his heart. His baby boy was in the arms of the young black maid, but what froze him in place was the sight of soft silk tied gently around the baby's little hands. His instinct screamed betrayal, his mind racing with the worst possibilities. But within moments, the truth unraveled into something so emotional and unpredictable that it would change his life, and his view of this young woman, forever. The day had started like any other for billionaire Alexander Grant, a man whose empire stretched across continents, yet whose heart was anchored in the quiet moments he spent with his infant son, Noah. For weeks, Alexander had been away in Europe negotiating deals worth billions, sleeping in hotel suites that felt more like glass cages than havens, and walking into boardrooms where every handshake came with a hidden blade. But despite the glitter of wealth and the constant whirl of power, the one image that kept him grounded was that of Noah's round, innocent face, framed by a shock of soft golden hair and the sweet gurgles he made when he recognized his father's voice. That morning, exhaustion pressed on Alexander like a second skin, but a sudden impulse gripped him. He decided to return home 2 days earlier than planned. He wanted to surprise his son, and perhaps, if he were being honest with himself, to check on the young maid who had become a peculiar but constant presence in their lives. Her name was Grace, a 22-year-old woman whose background was shrouded in quiet resilience. She had applied for the job months ago, with nothing more than a thin resume, tired shoes, and eyes that carried both sorrow and determination. Something in her story had struck Alexander when he interviewed her himself, an unusual act, considering he normally left staffing to agencies. She had said she wanted a chance, any chance, to build a life with dignity, and she would protect Noah as if he were her own. It was the way she said those words, with trembling hands but a steady voice, that had persuaded him to take a leap of faith. Yet trust, Alexander knew, was fragile, especially when it came to his son, his only living connection to his late wife. When he pulled up to the sprawling estate that afternoon, the sunlight cast long golden rays over the manicured lawns, the grand fountain sparkled like crystal, and the staff scurried about as though preparing for his unexpected arrival. But Alexander's eyes narrowed when he noticed the quiet coming from Noah's nursery upstairs. Normally, laughter or soft lullabies spilled into the hallway. Today, silence reigned. His heart quickened as he strode up the staircase, polished mahogany creaking beneath his hurried steps. And then he stopped, frozen at the doorframe, as the sight before him both confused and alarmed him. Grace was there, her dark curls pulled into a bun, her face flushed with concentration. Noah sat in his crib, and to Alexander's horror, a length of soft silk ribbon bound his tiny hands loosely together. For a split second, rage boiled in his veins. How dare she? His entire body tensed, his instinct to protect his child battling with the disbelief that the gentle, almost fragile woman he had hired could commit such cruelty. Yet something in her expression gave him pause. Grace wasn't smirking or careless. She was on the verge of tears, her lips trembling as though she were whispering prayers. Her hands shook as she adjusted the silk, her movements tender rather than harsh, and her eyes darted not to Noah, but to the window, as though expecting something or someone on the other side. Alexander's throat tightened, torn between storming in and demanding answers or waiting to see what unfolded. In that breathless moment, standing half-hidden in the nursery doorway, he realized he might not know Grace at all, and whatever secret was unfolding before his eyes would change. Everything to Alexander's fists clenched at his sides as he took one slow step into the room, the faint creak of the polished floorboard breaking the fragile silence. Grace flinched, her head snapping toward him, and in that instant, Alexander saw a flicker of panic cross her face. Not guilt exactly, but something rawer, deeper, like a wound torn open. Noah gurgled softly, the silk still tied around his tiny hands, though not tight enough to cause pain. His son's innocent eyes looked up at both adults, unaware of the storm brewing. Alexander's voice came out low and harsh, the kind of tone that made board members sweat during negotiations. "Explain. Now." His chest rose and fell with controlled fury, every protective instinct blazing, but Grace didn't immediately answer. Her lips parted, but no words came, as if her throat had forgotten how to form sound. She stood frozen for several heartbeats, then finally whispered, "Please, sir, it's not what you think." Those words, so often the anthem of deceit, ignited Alexander's suspicion further. Yet his gaze caught the tremor in her hands, the way her entire body seemed to tremble as though she were standing on the edge of a precipice. He stepped closer, his eyes darting between Noah and the silk ribbon, his mind searching for logic. Why tie the baby at all? Grace swallowed hard, tears brimming in her eyes. "I wasn't hurting him," she said quickly, shaking her head with desperate urgency. "I would never hurt him." Her voice cracked on the word never, and Alexander felt the sting of her conviction, but anger still coursed hot in his veins. "Then what is this?" he demanded, pointing to the silk with a sharp motion. "What could possibly justify this?" Grace's shoulders shook as she finally found the courage to meet his eyes. Because he wouldn't stop shaking. The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile and strange, confusing Alexander more than clarifying anything. "Shaking," he echoed, his brows furrowed. He bent toward Noah, scanning his son's face, his tiny body, searching for signs of distress. But Noah smiled at him, unbothered, as though mocking the tension thickening in the room. Grace hurried forward, her movements fueled by urgency. "Sir, I swear to you." The silk was only to keep his hands still for a moment. "I was watching." He started twitching. His little arms, they wouldn't stop moving. Alexander's heart lurched at her words. A chill cut through his anger, replaced by a gnawing fear he had never wanted to confront. "What are you saying?" he asked, his tone losing some of its bite, now laced with something almost vulnerable. Grace pressed her hand against her chest as though steadying her own heartbeat. "I don't know for certain," she admitted, her voice quivering. "But I've seen this before. My baby brother, he used to have seizures. Small at first, just little jerks of his hands like Noah did. Nobody listened to me back then until it was too late." Her breath hitched, her tears finally spilling. He died because no one believed me." The room seemed to shrink around Alexander, the air thick with grief he hadn't known belonged to Grace. His anger faltered, his mind trying to reconcile the image of her tying Noah's hands with the story she was unraveling. He looked at the silk again, realizing it wasn't a cruel restraint, but a desperate, clumsy attempt to observe, to confirm, to protect in the only way she knew. For the first time, Alexander saw not a maid caught in wrongdoing, but a young woman haunted by ghosts of her past. Still, his protective nature demanded clarity. "And you thought binding him was the answer?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost weary. Grace's chin quivered as she nodded faintly. "I didn't know what else to do, sir. I panicked. I thought if I could steady his arms, I could be sure it wasn't just a baby's random movement." She looked down, ashamed. "I was wrong to act without telling you first. But please believe me. I was trying to protect him, not harm him." Alexander felt his chest tighten, torn between fury at her rash action and compassion for the pain bleeding through her words. His late wife, Amelia, had once confessed a similar fear when Noah was a newborn. Every strange cough, every twitch, every cry had sent her spiraling into panic. Alexander remembered holding her hand through sleepless nights, reassuring her, whispering promises he hadn't always believed himself. Now, standing in front of Grace, he saw that same desperate fear reflected back at him, amplified by the scars of her own tragic past. The silk ribbon no longer looked sinister. It looked like the trembling grasp of a woman reliving a nightmare, trying to keep another child safe the way she couldn't with her brother. For the first time since entering the room, Alexander's voice gentled. "Grace," he said slowly, "if what you suspect is true, if there's even the smallest chance, then we need to get Noah checked. Immediately." Her wide eyes blinked up at him, filled with shock that he wasn't firing her on the spot, that he was instead acknowledging her fear as valid. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "You believe me?" Alexander hesitated, looking once more at his son's bright, trusting eyes. I don't know what I believe yet, he admitted honestly, but I know I can't risk being wrong. Not with him. In that moment, the tension in the room shifted from accusation to fragile alliance, and the first threads of an unpredictable bond began to weave between Billionaire and Maid. Threads spun not from wealth or employment, but from shared fear, pain, and the desperate hope of protecting an innocent life. The drive to the pediatric hospital felt longer than any international flight Alexander had ever endured. The sleek black Bentley sped through the city streets, but for him, each traffic light was a mountain, and every red brake light a wall between him and the answers he so desperately craved. Noah cooed softly in his car's seat, blissfully unaware of the storm of fear swirling around him. Grace sat beside the baby, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles pale, her eyes refusing to lift from the child she had vowed to protect. Alexander gripped the wheel, so hard his knuckles mirrored hers, his thoughts spiraling in directions he hadn't allowed himself to explore before. What if Grace was right? What if the twitching wasn't just a baby's restless energy, but something more sinister, something hidden beneath Noah's cherubic innocence? He couldn't lose him, not after losing Amelia. The thought of burying his wife had nearly destroyed him. The thought of losing their only son was unbearable. As they neared the hospital, Grace finally broke the silence, her voice trembling as though she were afraid to disturb the fragile quiet. "I didn't mean to scare you, sir," she whispered. "But when I saw his little hands jerking like that, I just saw my brother all over again." She turned her head toward the window, her reflection shadowed in the glass. "We lived in a small town in Georgia. We didn't have money for doctors, not even for regular checkups. My mother worked 2 jobs, my father was gone before I could walk, and I was just a girl. I didn't know what seizures even were until it was too late. He was only 5 months old when I held him in my arms and couldn't stop it." Her voice cracked, and her shoulders quaked with the memory. Alexander swallowed hard, the pain in her voice burrowing deep into his chest. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but words felt useless when grief that raw filled the air. Instead, he let his silence be his acknowledgement, his tightening grip on the steering wheel the only signal of how deeply her story struck him. By the time they reached the hospital, Alexander was already striding ahead, his authoritative presence cutting through the sterile hallways like a blade. Nurses recognized him immediately. His wealth and influence were no secrets, but he waved away the deference. "My son needs to be seen. Now." The urgency in his voice brooked no argument. Within minutes, Noah was being examined by a pediatric neurologist, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Patel, whose calm demeanor belied the weight of the situation. Alexander stood at Noah's side, one hand resting protectively on his son's tiny chest, while Grace lingered near the door, as though uncertain whether she had the right to stay. But Noah's small hand reached toward her, gurgling with recognition, and even Dr. Patel noticed the bond, nodding for her to step closer. The examination was methodical, reflex checks, gentle prods, questions about family history. Alexander answered what he could, though grief choked him when Amelia's absence was mentioned. Grace spoke softly when asked about what she saw, recounting the jerking movements with a detail that only someone haunted by memory could provide. Her voice trembled, but her eyes stayed fixed on Noah, as if sheer willpower could shield him from harm. After what felt like hours, Dr. Patel finally straightened, her expression serious yet not devoid of compassion. "Mr. Grant," she began, her voice steady, "what Grace observed is important. Babies often have reflexive movements, but there are cases where those can indicate something neurological. I won't jump to conclusions yet. We need tests. EEG monitoring, scans, blood work. It's too early to diagnose, but..." She paused, her eyes softening. "You did the right thing bringing him in immediately." Relief and dread collided inside Alexander like clashing tides. He wasn't imagining it. Grace hadn't been imagining it. The possibility loomed. His son might be facing something larger than either of them had dared to admit. He closed his eyes briefly, drawing a breath that felt like glass in his lungs. "Do whatever it takes," he ordered, his voice gruff. "Money isn't a concern. Just make sure my boy gets what he needs." Grace's eyes welled again, her gaze flickering between Alexander and Noah. For the first time since he had walked into that nursery, she saw not just a billionaire, but a father stripped bare, his wealth meaningless against the fear of losing his child. As they wheeled Noah away for tests, Alexander found himself outside the examination room with Grace at his side. For several moments, neither spoke. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "If you hadn't noticed, if you hadn't acted," his voice faltered, something it rarely did in boardrooms or interviews. "Maybe I wouldn't have brought him here today." Grace looked down, wiping a tear that trailed down her cheek. "I know it wasn't the right way," she admitted softly, "but I couldn't ignore what I saw. I promised myself after my brother that I'd never stay silent again." Her words, fragile yet powerful, struck Alexander harder than any deal gone wrong or any rival's betrayal. He realized that beneath her trembling and mistakes was a woman who carried scars deeper than most could imagine, scars that fueled her fierce instinct to protect. And for the first time, Alexander felt the beginnings of gratitude. Gratitude toward a maid he had almost dismissed as reckless. Gratitude toward the strange twist of fate that had put her in Noah's life. As he leaned back against the cold white wall of the hospital corridor, his head tilting upward toward the fluorescent lights, he whispered a silent prayer. Not to his wealth, not to his power, but to whatever force might spare his child and allow this unpredictable, fragile alliance between him and Grace to mean something more than tragedy. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Alexander's life. He had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, and even the slow agony of watching Amelia fade away in her hospital bed, but nothing compared to sitting in a sterile waiting room while strangers in white coats tested his only son. The hours that followed were some of the longest of Alexander's life. He had faced hostile takeovers, courtroom battles, and even the slow agony of watching Amelia fade away in her hospital bed, but nothing compared to sitting in a sterile waiting room while strangers in white coats tested his only son. The ticking of the wall clock was a merciless drum, each second stretching into eternity. He sat rigid in one of the plastic chairs, his tailored suit wrinkled from hours of stillness, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Across from him, Grace sat with her hands folded, her gaze fixed on the floor. The contrast between them couldn't have been sharper. He was the billionaire whose name could open doors across the globe. She was the maid whose life had been carved by hardship. But in that waiting room, stripped of wealth and titles, there were simply two souls bound by fear for the same child. Alexander's mind raced with dark possibilities. What if Noah did have seizures? What if this was the beginning of a lifelong condition that money couldn't cure? He thought of Amelia again, of the way she had held Noah in the hospital after giving birth, whispering promises to protect him from everything. Alexander had repeated those promises after she was gone, swearing he would never let their son suffer. Now, staring at the double doors of the testing wing, he felt like a liar, powerless and small in a way he hadn't felt since his wife's funeral. Grace shifted in her chair, her voice breaking the silence in the gentlest whisper. "I'm sorry, sir, for scaring you, for tying him without asking." Alexander looked at her, his eyes narrowing at first, but then softening when he saw the way she hugged her arms as though she were holding herself together. He exhaled heavily, the fight draining from him. "You were wrong to act without telling me," he said, his tone firm but not cruel. "But you were right to see what I didn't. I should be thanking you, not tearing you apart." Grace blinked in surprise, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "You believe me now?" she asked, almost like a child asking for forgiveness. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the hallway again. "I believe you care about him. And right now, that's all that matters." For the first time, a small flicker of warmth passed between. For the first time, a small flicker of warmth passed between them, fragile but undeniable, like a candle trembling in the draft of a storm. Grace wiped her cheek quickly, embarrassed by the vulnerability she had shown, but Alexander didn't look away. He wasn't seeing a maid anymore, nor just an employee who happened to notice something odd about his child. He was seeing a young woman whose life had been shaped by loss and who had chosen to transform that pain into vigilance. In some strange way, her grief had given Noah a chance, and that realization tightened something in his chest that no amount of wealth could loosen. The waiting dragged on. Nurses came and went, murmuring updates, but never offering answers concrete enough to soothe his pounding heart. At one point, Grace stood and walked toward a vending machine, her hands trembling as she fed coins into the slot. She came back with a bottle of water, handing it to Alexander without a word. He stared at it for a moment, as though the simple gesture disarmed him more than any grand display of loyalty could have. He took it, their fingers brushing briefly, and for the first time since Amelia's passing, he felt that strange, fleeting sense of not being completely alone. Then at last, the door opened and Dr. Patel stepped in. Both Alexander and Grace shot to their feet at once, their eyes searching the doctor's face for clues before she even spoke. Her expression was professional, but there was a softness there, too, as though she knew the weight of her words. "Mr. Grant," she began, "we've completed the initial EEG and scans. The good news is that Noah's brain activity appears normal at this stage. We didn't find evidence of a seizure during the monitoring period." Relief surged through Alexander, so powerful he had to grip the back of the chair to steady himself. His knees threatened to buckle, and he closed his eyes briefly, whispering a silent thank you. Grace, too, let out a trembling sigh, her shoulders sagging with release. But before they could celebrate, Dr. Patel raised a hand gently. "However," she continued, "that doesn't mean nothing is wrong. Babies are complex. What Grace described could very well have been benign, random newborn movements, but it could also be the early sign of something more. Epileptic disorders can be intermittent, and sometimes we don't catch them right away. We'll need to continue observation, possibly even send you home with a portable monitor." The relief that had swelled in Alexander's chest thinned instantly, replaced with cautious dread. It wasn't a clean bill of health, not yet. The uncertainty was almost worse than bad news, because it left him suspended in limbo. Grace, however, stepped forward, her voice quiet but resolute. "Then we'll watch him. Every day. I'll stay by his side every night if I have to." Dr. Patel smiled faintly, impressed by the maid's fierce protectiveness. Alexander turned to look at Grace, his brow furrowed, but instead of admonishing her for speaking out of turn, he found himself nodding in agreement. "She's right," he said. "Noah won't be left unwatched. Not for a second." Dr. Patel explained the next steps, scheduling follow-up tests, and giving them both a crash course in signs to look for. Arching of the back, sudden stiffness, repeated jerking. Alexander listened intently, absorbing every word, while Grace scribbled notes on a scrap of paper she pulled from her pocket. Watching her so focused, so determined, Alexander felt something shift inside him. He realized he wasn't just relieved for his son. He was grateful that Grace had been there, that she had cared enough to notice what even he had missed. After Dr. Patel left, they lingered in the quiet room, Noah asleep in his crib by the window. The late afternoon sun painted the walls in shades of gold, casting long shadows across the sterile floor. Alexander moved to stand beside the crib, his hand resting lightly on Noah's blanket. Grace hovered nearby, unsure whether to speak. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "Do you know what the unpredictable part of all this is?" he asked, his eyes still fixed on his son. Grace frowned slightly, uncertain if it was a rhetorical question. "That I almost fired you today," he continued, his voice low but filled with uncharacteristic honesty. "I walked into that nursery ready to tear your world apart. And now, standing here, I can't imagine what would have happened if you hadn't been there." Grace's breath caught in her throat, her eyes glistening. She wanted to say something, but her words tangled in her chest. Finally, she whispered, "Sometimes the people you least expect are the ones meant to save you." Alexander turned then, his gaze locking onto hers. For the first time, he truly looked at her, not as the maid he had hired out of pity or necessity, but as someone whose presence had become intertwined with his son's fate. The unpredictability wasn't just about Noah's health anymore. It was about the strange, unexpected bond forming between a grieving billionaire and a broken young woman, bound together by love for a child who had no idea how much power he held over both of them. The days after the hospital visit unfolded like a tightrope walk, every moment balanced between relief and dread. Back at the Grant estate, Noah was fitted with a portable monitor, a nest of tiny wires and sensors gently attached to his head while he slept. The sight of his little boy, burdened with medical equipment, shattered Alexander in ways he didn't show aloud. He prowled the hallways at night, unable to sleep, often finding himself outside Noah's nursery door just to listen for steady breaths. Grace, true to her word, never left the child's side. She sat in a rocking chair through the nights, her dark curls falling over her tired face, whispering lullabies in a voice so soft it seemed to calm even Alexander's frayed nerves. But their uneasy alliance didn't remain private for long. Word traveled quickly through the house staff, how Mr. Grant had stormed into the nursery, how the maid had tied the baby, how instead of firing her he had taken her to the hospital. Rumors grew legs, twisting into whispers of impropriety and negligence. And it wasn't long before those whispers reached the ears of Alexander's mother, Eleanor Grant, a woman of old money and sharper judgment. She arrived unannounced one crisp morning, her pearls gleaming, her eyes cold with disapproval. "Alexander," she said the moment she crossed the threshold, "I've heard disturbing things." She wasted no time, her voice slicing through the foyer like glass. "That Maid Grace, is it? She bound my grandson? And you defended her." Alexander pinched the bridge of his nose, already weary from sleepless nights. "Mother, it's not what you think." But Eleanor's gaze was unyielding. "I think it's exactly what it sounds like. She's unfit. She's reckless. And if you weren't blinded by grief and desperation, you'd see it too." Grace, who had been hovering nearby with Noah in her arms, froze at the words. Her cheeks burned, shame and anger battling in her chest. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the weight of Eleanor's presence pressed her into silence. Alexander's jaw tightened. For years, he had allowed his mother's influence to shape decisions, but now he felt something stir inside him, defiance born from gratitude, from the bond that had grown between Grace and his son. "You weren't there," he said firmly. "You didn't see what she saw. If not for her, Noah might not be under observation right now. She noticed what I didn't." Eleanor scoffed, her heels clicking against the marble as she advanced. "And you trust her? A maid, Alexander? A girl from nowhere? You've lost Amelia, and now you're clinging to anyone who shows you kindness. It's pathetic." The words struck deep, but instead of crumbling, Alexander squared his shoulders. He glanced at Grace, who looked as though she wished the floor would swallow her whole. Noah stirred in her arms, letting out a small cry, and Grace instinctively soothed him, her touch tender, practiced. Watching her, Alexander felt his resolve harden. "You may not trust her, Mother," he said, his voice low but resolute. "But I do. And until I have reason not to, she stays." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flashing with fury. "Then you've lost your judgment. Mark my words, Alexander, you'll regret this indulgence." With that, she swept out of the room, leaving silence in her wake. Grace stood frozen, tears threatening to spill. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant to cause trouble between you and your family." Alexander turned to her, his gaze steady. "You didn't cause this. My mother doesn't understand. She never will." He stepped closer, his eyes softening. "What matters is Noah, and he needs you. I see that now." The words hit Grace like sunlight after a storm, warming places in her heart she had long thought dead. For so long, she had been treated as invisible, a shadow moving silently through wealthy households. But here was a man who not only saw her, but defended her. It was unpredictable, almost impossible, and yet it was happening. That night, after the confrontation, Alexander found himself sitting across from Grace at the long dining table, Noah asleep upstairs. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke. You know, in business, I'm trained to expect the unexpected. But nothing has surprised me more than this. Grace tilted her head, puzzled. This? Alexander's lips curved into the faintest smile. That I'd come to trust you. That I'd find comfort in your presence. Grace's breath caught, her heart thundering. She looked down at her hands, too overwhelmed to respond. But deep inside, she knew something had shifted permanently between them. Not romance. Not yet. But a bond built on shared fear, sacrifice, and the fragile hope that perhaps unpredictability wasn't always something to dread. Sometimes, it was the very thing that saved you. The following week felt like a test of faith neither Alexander nor Grace had prepared for. Noah's portable monitor clicked and hummed quietly, a constant reminder of the uncertainty hanging over their lives. Every twitch of his little body sent Alexander bolting from his study. Every whimper jolted Grace from the light sleep she managed to catch in the rocking chair. The tension in the house was palpable, like a storm cloud refusing to break. Then, one late evening, the monitor beeped sharply, a sound so piercing it made Alexander's blood run cold. He was in his office, poring over documents he could barely focus on when the alarm went off. His heart slammed against his ribs as he sprinted down the hallway, bursting into the nursery to find Grace already cradling Noah, her hand steady despite the tears streaking her cheeks. "It happened," she whispered hoarsely. He seized. Alexander's world tilted, the walls closing in, but he forced himself to focus. Grace's calm under pressure anchored him. She was already laying Noah gently on his side, speaking softly as she monitored his tiny body. The seizure was brief, terrifyingly brief, as though fate had played a cruel trick to confirm their worst fears. By the time they reached the hospital again, Dr. Patel confirmed what they had dreaded. "It was a seizure," she said gently, her eyes filled with empathy. "The EEG recorded it. This means we can start treatment early, and that gives Noah the best chance." The words hit Alexander like both a hammer and a lifeline. His son was sick, yes, but he was not doomed. They had caught it early. There was hope. Relief and despair warred within him, leaving him shaken. Grace sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly, silent tears streaming. Alexander turned to her, his throat thick with emotion. "You saved him," he said quietly. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "No, I just did what I had to. I couldn't let another baby slip away." But Alexander stepped closer, his voice steadier this time. "Grace, I didn't see it. I would have dismissed it. Without you, he wouldn't have been diagnosed this soon. You didn't just protect him. You gave him a future." The gratitude in his voice was raw, stripped of pride, stripped of the billionaire's usual armor. For a moment, Grace felt as though she might collapse under the weight of it, because no one had ever spoken to her that way. Not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as someone who mattered. In the days that followed, treatment began. Medications, appointments, new routines. It was overwhelming, but Alexander was no longer alone in it. Grace became more than the maid. She was Noah's guardian in every sense, his shield in the night, his comfort in the day. Slowly, the rumors in the household faded, silenced by the undeniable truth that she was indispensable. Even Eleanor, though she never admitted it aloud, grew quieter in her criticisms after seeing Noah's progress. One evening, weeks later, Alexander stood in the nursery doorway, watching Grace rock Noah to sleep. The child's breathing was steady, the monitor silent for once, and Grace's lullaby was soft as a prayer. Alexander leaned against the frame, his heart heavy and light all at once. "You know," he said softly, "when I first walked in and saw you with that silk, I thought you were harming him. I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life trusting you." Grace looked up, her eyes meeting his in the dim glow of the nightlight. "And now?" she asked quietly. Alexander's voice was low, filled with a sincerity she hadn't heard from him before. "Now I know that the most unpredictable moment of my life was also the one that saved us all." Grace blinked back tears, her lips trembling as she smiled faintly. "Sometimes," she whispered, The world gives you the right people at the wrong time. And sometimes that's exactly when you need them most. The nursery fell into silence then, but it wasn't the heavy silence of fear. It was peace, fragile, fleeting, but real. Alexander looked at Noah, then at Grace, and realized his life had been altered forever by the unpredictability of a single moment. The billionaire who thought he had everything had discovered that salvation didn't come from wealth or power. It came from a maid with a scarred past, a child's fragile heartbeat, and the courage to face what others were too blind to see. And though the road ahead would be long, uncertain, and filled with battles yet to come, Alexander knew he wasn't walking it alone.